I'm so excited to be speaking today about trust in today's workforce. So having said that, let's get started. Okay, so today we'll be talking about why trust is important in today's day and age and why we should care. So with that, I want to start with the outline of what we'll be discussing. So what's going on in today that makes trust especially imperative for having employees stay at work? I want to go through how we define trust. How do we conceptualize it? What is it specifically in the workplace? And then how do we facilitate trust between all the different types of relationships that are at work? So between managers and employees, an organization and all their employees, and then peer-to-peer, so throughout all the coworkers. How do we facilitate trust between them? And then what do we do when trust is broken? How do we rebuild with our employees to make sure that they stay at our organization? Lastly, I have some thoughts in terms of how trust can be applied to cultural fit or cultural add. And then we'll just go through a brief summary of everything we've gone through today. So having said that, let's get started. So why is trust so important in today's day and age? So trust is vital in the age of change. And I think that today, especially, what all organizations have in common is how much change we're going through. And this is specifically really applied in the age of technology. So we have so much technology in their human resource systems. We have automation that's really changing the roles of people's jobs and their understanding of their future within their role, and also even the trust in the technology that we use. But there's other just variety of changes in the way that our organizations are even running today. For example, there's kind of a talent war going on. So we have so many vacancies that we may need to fill, but we need highly skilled workers, and there might not be enough in the talent pool. There's also a very mobile workforce, and this links back to the fact that there may be so many vacancies in certain jobs that people want to jump around, and they're able to, jump ship really fast, as well as we're looking at more of a global workforce than ever. So not only do we have employees that are around the world, we may be servicing clients that are around the world. And so all of these changes need support so that employees can trust in all of these processes and want to stay at the organization. So just building on some of these examples and changes that organizations are going through, we have automation, we have connection throughout the world, we have someone, a picture of someone on their cell phone here. It's not just about, using a cell phone at work. It's about the change of potentially always being connected at work. So, with the changing time zones, it's making sure that, we're staying connected with our colleagues in another place. And how does that affect our presence in the office that we're in? The last picture, on the bottom left here is a picture of just people talking. And the reason I've included it is because there's another change that, has been occurring in the last several years in HR is, HR is becoming public relations, is becoming something that's at the forefront that employees and applicants are looking at. So if there's changes that the business is going through or, there's distrust in the organization, that's going to become public. And so all of these things really affect trust in a way that makes it super important to focus on in initiatives of today. But what are the barriers? So because I've talked about sort of the changes that are going on in today's day and age, naturally, some barriers have come up. So I've gone through the organizational change, the middle point here, technologically, globally, and structurally, but also, this aspect of virtual relationships. So just going back to that point that we're connected globally, that we're always connected on our phone, but also that we have to build virtual relationships. And that makes, building trust very, very hard. And we'll dive deeper in that later in the presentation when I speak to, how to build peer-to-peer trust. But it does make it super hard when you're not in person, even though, there is great technological advances in terms of video conferencing, et cetera. The last barrier that I want to talk about that I haven't really spoke to yet is this lack of interpersonal skills. And you'll see here in the brackets, I've put EI, emotional intelligence, which is often what people refer to this as. And there's kind of a mix here in terms of two things that are going on when I mean lack of interpersonal skills. So one is because of this change of technology, it's affected us in multiple ways, especially in people skills. And often we're not in person as much anymore. We're not building empathy. We're not building soft skills. And that affects the abilities of our managers and our trust in our managers and our managers and leaders' ability to build trust, because there's such a concentration on just remote or technology or emails that they're not using that skill. They're not building this interpersonal skill. The second point I want to make about how this is a barrier is that managers are often still promoted based on, their skills in the current role that they're in rather than their people skills. And so again, when they're, promoted to a manager, what people skills do they have? What training do they have? How are we coaching them? How are we helping them to be really good at empathy and building trust with their teams? And so that's kind of another main barrier to building trust in the workplace as well. So having said all of that, I want to sidetrack and jump right into what is trust. So I personally, when I first started thinking about what trust is, before I dive deep into what the research says or what's out there in the literature, I wanted to think myself about what I even thought trust is. And I did a pretty bad job. I couldn't really, it's something intangible. I understood what it meant, but I couldn't write out in a sentence or think about what are the components that make up trust. So I also asked internally and asked around people that I work with if they could conceptualize or define what trust is. And a lot of people had difficulty, despite understanding what the concept was, is really putting it to words. Luckily, people that, are much smarter than me were able to find a great conceptualization, which I'm going to share now, that really resonated with me. And I hope that it resonates with you. It's from two academic researchers, and they break down trust into three parts. So the three parts are competence, integrity, and benevolence. And I've put in the brackets here some other terms as well that sort of map on to that three-word framework that builds up trust. And that's based on another researcher, Francis Frey, who also defined trust. But it maps on really well to this original framework here. So I want to talk about what each of these pieces mean, especially in terms of defining trust at work. So we have the first one, competence or rigor and logic. So competence really just means that you trust a person to be able to complete the task that you ask them, or really just that you trust someone, they're able to do their job. Integrity is that you trust that someone aligns with your values, and, going with a little bit of the authenticity part, building that into this framework as well. And it captures, being yourself and really creating a safe space. And last is benevolence, which is this empathy piece of it. So that you have someone else's back, or you have the best interest at heart. So someone believes that about you, is that kind of benevolence piece as well. There's different things that we can do to kind of display these areas of trust. So competence, for example, you think that the only way that we can kind of think about competence and trust is, if someone does do their job, that's how we build that up. But there's actually some ways that people can present their ideas so that we believe that they're competent. So, for example, displaying your ideas in concise manner. And the way that I think about it is, if you think about any writing piece, you've ever done in your life, or thinking back, learning to write even, and they tell you, write a topic sentence and then your ideas and then a concluding sentence. And I think about that in terms of how to display your ideas and be seen as competent. So if you have an idea, you want to explain, okay, this is what my idea is and this is why. and to summarize, this is what we should do about it. And that's how you can really display competence. And it's kind of like a trick, and that's how we should be training people to, behave in meetings so that people can see and understand their ideas in a concise way and understand the justification for the ways that decisions are made. Another way that competence is displayed at work is documentation. So not only is this just helpful to have in an organization so that we know how decisions are made, so that there's knowledge sharing, but it genuinely also promotes competence, because when things aren't documented and employees don't understand how decisions are made, we can't really trust that there was a lot of thinking into them. So it's really good to have concise ideas, justification for what you've done, and documentation. And that all really helps build trust, and specifically into this competence piece of it. So the next is integrity. And for integrity, you really want to focus on consistent messaging and supporting and bringing up others. And as I mentioned before, making a safe space. So you can, imagine in a situation where someone doesn't say the same thing about a certain situation or event at work and says different things to different people, how that could make another employee not trust them in terms of their integrity. And so for this piece of it, you really want to focus that someone is showing consistent messages throughout the business, no matter who they're interacting with. And again, that emphasizes also that other piece, the authenticity piece, because you're not changing who you are based on who you're talking to, you're staying true to who you are. And lastly, this benevolence piece. So this focuses on empathy and really understanding what someone's needs are. So when you are thinking about someone who you trust, especially in the area of benevolence, they would be displaying, active listening behaviors. And so that looks like, when you talk to them, are they asking questions? Are they nodding? Are they giving your full attention? Are distractions limited? So you want to make sure that, I guess for this piece, if you want to really increase people's beliefs that they trust you in this area, that going back to, always being connected and stuff like that, that when you are talking to people that you're giving them your full attention, you're not on the phone, you're not thinking about something else. One example, when I started talking about this recently with one of our senior leaders, is he had mentioned that he'd gotten an Apple Watch, and he thought this was going to be super helpful, like quick responses to people, staying connected. But he realized, when he was giving one-on-one time with other employees, he was getting very distracted by the Apple Watch, but not just that, not just being distracted by the messages, but literally looking, at the wrist to signify what the time is kind of showing you that, you don't have time for that person. So that's how that can signify that. So those are kind of pieces on how we can improve all these little parts of trust. So having that information, I just thought it would be interesting for us all to think about a least preferred coworker and most preferred coworker, and what part of trust they most embody. So I think that this can all help us kind of understand ourselves more and understand kind of what we think about when we hire people or when we think someone would be a good fit into a team. It may be that one of these aspects are more important or salient to us or to a manager, and that's why we really focus. And so knowing this can help us understand what kinds of people we want in our organization. And it's just kind of interesting to think about for ourselves and understand more about our values as well. So before I dive deeper into what kind of trust relationships exist at work, I want to step back and talk about sort of the science behind trust. It's kind of interesting to learn about. So trust is related to a neurotransmitter called oxytocin. And this is a neurotransmitter that for other animals, it goes off when it signifies safety when another animal is approaching you. And so research recent research on sort of human behavior and how oxytocin plays a role in trust looked at what happens when in the lab participants came in and they measured, how willing participants were to share with one another. And they found that the release of oxytocin in the brain influenced how much you share and how much you trust other people. And in fact, it wasn't just an association. They found that increases in levels of oxytocin actually caused more trusting behaviors. And they tested this by actually giving people nasal spray of oxytocin. Obviously, in a workplace setting, we would never want that to happen, and we never want, to induce oxytocin levels. But what implication it has is that engaging in other behaviors that increase human levels of oxytocin can also increase trust with one another. So behaviors like that include, deeper social ties. So when we create social ties with others, it releases oxytocin. And we'll talk a lot about that further in the presentation, when we're talking about peer-to-peer trust. Another way that oxytocin is released in the brain is actually asking for advice. That's another way, and that will further build trust as well. So that's just a little bit of background on what's going on in the brain and what's happening when we're trusting one another. So moving on to what trust relationships exist at work. So there's three main types: vertical, institutional, and horizontal. So vertical is this manager-employee relationship. This relationship is quite challenging because of the underlying power structure. So it's super hard to trust someone when they have control over your development, your future, your compensation, promotions. So that's a very difficult relationship to kind of unpack and really understand how we can facilitate trust there. Having said that, I'm definitely sharing in a bit how we can facilitate trust in that type of relationship. I just did want to share that is kind of challenging there. And in fact, the higher a manager goes up, the harder it is to trust them. So the wider the power differential, the more difficult it is to create that trusting relationship. There's also institutional trust, and this is the relationship between the employee and the organization. And then lastly, horizontal. So this is basically just peer-to-peer. We focus a lot, or I'll be focusing a lot on sort of like facilitating deeper connections and team trust. And that will kind of be the bulk of a lot of the take-homes in terms of how to facilitate trust is in the area of the peer-to-peer. This is just because there's a lot of research here, but again, we'll still be sharing a lot in terms of vertical and institutional trust. Okay, so let's start and dive right into vertical or manager trust and what we can do at work to facilitate and really create a trusting environment. So the first point I want to make is really encouraging employees to have autonomy and reducing hierarchical structures. So this kind of has multiple implications. So reducing hierarchical structures allows, everyone to sort of have a voice, but what it also does is it shows employees that, we're all on the same page, we're all on the same level, and that a manager is one of them. And that's really important for building a bond and getting everyone on the same page. So this is a really important step, both for employees to feel like they have a voice, they can say what they need to say, but also so that they can, connect with the manager on a deeper level because they feel like they're on level playing field. And just building on that as well is this level of autonomy. So managers giving employees a level of autonomy. And if you think back to sort of the conceptualization that we went through with manager trust, one of the key parts was competence. And so when managers are kind of encouraging a level of autonomy from these employees, they're also demonstrating that they trust them in the way of competence, that they believe that they're competent to do their own job. The managers don't really need to watch them and see what's going on. And I think this first point here, relates to a couple on the bottom, involvement in decision making, again, relates back to this competence piece, and you're showing your employees that you trust that they are competent. And again, with encouraging exploration and encouraging trying new things at the organization, you're showing them that you trust them in the level of competence. And telling someone that you trust them is very important. It's actually been proven to help the relationship be trusting overall. So if your manager tells their employees that he or she or they trust them, then the trust usually is reciprocal. So you start to open up more when you know someone trusts you. So that leads to this other point where telling your employees trust them is super important. So it's not just the actions that you're doing to show people that you trust them. Actually telling them will also have that impact and really start to facilitate that relationship. Another point I think I skipped over here was knowledge sharing. So just updating employees on, what's going on and making sure, and this is for the manager to update employees, again, is kind of showing them that you trust them, and that's how it's super helpful as well. Again, we've talked about this, but, focus and limiting distractions is super important for demonstrating and facilitating trust. The next point is having managers, take responsibility for what they need to work on. Again, this is going back to this point, like showing that we're all on the same level playing field. We're all sort of one of each other on the team. And when managers don't take responsibility, it just creates this, it just exemplifies the power structure basically, and it can break down that trusting relationship. So it's super important to make sure that managers are taking the time to rectify and understand what they're also working toward to really highlight the similarities in the group. The next point seems really, self-explanatory, like no favoritism, but it really does pull at that part of trust benevolence. So if employees are seeing that their managers, favor certain team members, they're not going to trust that that manager has their back. And if they feel like their manager is not an ally, they really aren't going to trust them at all. So that's super important. And it just goes on to the next point with advocate. You want to be an advocate, for your employees. And your employees want to know that their manager has their back, whether or not they're there in the meeting or they're not there in the meeting. And so that's really important as well. The last point about flexibility and working from home really, builds on that first point of autonomy. When you let employees kind of have the ability to be flexible, to work from home, do what they need to do, again, you're showing them that you trust them, which allows them to open up to you and also trust you. So it just goes back to that competence piece as well. So that's kind of how these are very high level, broad sort of recommendations in terms of facilitating manager and employee trust. But I think that you can start to get ideas on how this could be facilitated, whether that be through initiatives or through manager training, or even just educating managers on these types of behaviors. It's very easy to tell a manager how important it is to tell your team that you trust them, and that ultimately could be the first step and have really good benefits to helping create a really cohesive team and a really trusting atmosphere. So that could be a first step, and then going through these other sort of points here and understanding what a manager could take tangibly, the steps they could take tangibly at work. So having said that, I want to go forward and focus on institutional trust. So that is the trust between employees and the organization. And so I want to preface before I go through the recommendations is that the recommendations are definitely very high level for institutional trust. So there's transparency, and they're all quite connected. Transparency, open communication, admitting mistakes, and fairness and policy and procedures. And then when I went over this, they sound, again, self-explanatory. And I don't think any organization is going to say, we don't have open communication, we don't admit our mistakes, we don't have fairness. But we want to understand and we want to make sure that there's actually things put in place to ensure that this is happening. And I think even though these are super high level, at least that they can hopefully influence or maybe allow you to all to think about what sort of initiatives your organizations are doing that link to make sure that this is actually happening. So what are your organizations doing to make sure that there's a level of transparency at work, or that there's open communication? Even admitting mistakes is kind of a bizarre one, but how are, we iterating and coming together and sharing with each other our mistakes and learning from that? What initiatives are put into place? Is it just a value, or is there actual actions that are behind those things? And I think with these recommendations, although they're very high level, it really allowed even myself to start thinking about what we do here at Achievers to really help with this. And so I want to talk about one of the examples in terms of what we do to kind of facilitate some sort of transparency and open communication. And so the first is this concept. It was called Brutal Facts meetings. We don't do them anymore, which I'll talk about in a bit. But basically, these were meetings kind of like town halls, but there wasn't really an agenda. We had them in our big theater, and everyone was invited, or you could call in and really just ask open questions to any of the senior leadership team. And it really built this level of trust where you had this avenue where you can go up and ask the questions that you need to ask and hopefully get a really open and honest answer. What that has sort of turned into now is open town halls. So we do still have sort of this question and answer period where everyone's really open and everyone talks to each other and asks what they need to ask. But there's also more of a structured beginning and purpose to what will be going over for that day. I think that both of them have worked really, really well. And I definitely think that it is a step in the right direction for promoting those themes that really help with organizational trust. I also wanted to look into sort of what other organizations are doing. One organization called HubSpot, they went through, a huge extreme growth period. And they recognized that transparency was super important in those turbulent times. And it really, goes back to the beginning of the presentation that in turbulent times and in change, when your organizations are going through, huge changes, this is when trust is more important than ever. So they recognized that. And I read about how they really relied on frequent data and surveys to get their employees participating and really get real-time feedback so that the changes that they were making, they could get feedback from employees and act on that. We also have, frequent surveying tools. We have quarterly at Achievers and weekly so that we're able to put, real-time data and our organization is updated and can act very fast. This is especially important, like I said, when, someone joins the organization, on a leadership team and maybe the organization wants feedback or whatever it may be. So that is kind of another avenue for really promoting transparency and this open communication. And I think those have been really, really effective. So before we go on to sort of the horizontal trust, the peer-to-peer, I took a screen grab here of Simon Sinek's TED Talk called First, Why, Then Trust. And I definitely recommend anyone to go and check this out. Here he is speaking to, he speaks about an organization and basically how time goes on, they're making money, and they understand the why of the organization. So everyone's there for a purpose of what started and is all moving towards the same goal. And you can see in the picture here a circle. And that area is called the split. And it's when the sense of why is kind of gone. And that's when we become distrustful of others and our organization. And so I didn't really speak to this yet, but this really, drives home the idea that mission and vision are also really vital to organizational trust. Because when people don't understand the why of what's going on, they start to not trust what's going on at all. And so that's another piece to kind of building and maintaining this institutional trust, is making sure that the mission and values are still in place. And this is super hard again in this day and age when a lot of organizations are constantly changing and growing, and potentially what they did before or when they started has turned into so many things. But the clarity of the mission and values hasn't really changed for the employees, and there's some confusion. So I think this is a good point also in terms of facilitating institutional trust. But yeah, definitely check out that talk. So going forward to horizontal trust. So this is peer-to-peer trust or team trust. And as I mentioned, this part has quite a bit of research, but super, super interesting. So I'm excited to dive into this next section. So I'm going to start talking about horizontal trust by actually introducing a new concept. It's called psychological safety. And I don't know how many people are familiar with this concept, but it's this idea that you can speak up without repercussions. It's openness in a group, in a team. It's this ability to admit mistakes. I like to think about it as this combination of sort of trust and inclusion wrapped up in this one really cool concept. It was coined by Amy Edmondson, and she has done a lot of work and research on it. And one of the really interesting findings about psychological safety is that it's the main predictor of performance and learning at work, and that the highest performing teams have really, really high psychological safety. And what's so interesting about that is that it's found across the world. And that's super hard sometimes in human resource management, research or organizational psychology research, that it's found all like in the entire world, it's different organizations that they're finding that. And it just shows how important it really is. And it also encourages innovation, which makes complete sense because you can be with a team and you feel like you can be yourself, you can say whatever you need to say, and you won't be judged. And so that really can lead to really interesting new ideas. So Amy Edmondson sort of put it in one word, that psychological safety is candor. It's not really a focus on comfort. It's all of these things here. So it's a really interesting concept, and I think that it's a great way to think about what you're searching for when you're searching for, this type of horizontal trust. So before I go right into, facilitating horizontal trust and building it in teams and groups, I want everyone to think about sort of the people that they trust with their organization, and just ask themselves a couple questions. So, is trust context specific? So what I mean by that is that, are there certain people that you only trust in certain situations? And why is that? Or even, there's people you trust in certain components of the trust conceptualization. So you think they're highly competent, but benevolence, you're not so sure. Another thing to think about is, do your relationships stagnate? So do you kind of make an effort to build a relationship with others to a certain level and then not facilitate or build on that trust? And then lastly, do we only go to people at our organization and confide in them because we like them, or do we actually trust them? And these questions are just supposed to allow us to understand the complexity of our relationships at work, and to really understand if we do truly trust people around us, and do we trust them holistically in all the different avenues, or is there significant work we need to do to make deeper connections? Because deeper connections are the way to trusting people. So in the previous slides, I talked about, facilitating horizontal trust, facilitating vertical trust or institutional trust. But really, when it comes to facilitating horizontal trust, the answer is really getting to know people. And that is super important. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about how we really get to know people in a work context. So the first point is highlighting similarities, and that builds trust. And this is sort of a common idea that when you highlight similarities between you and others, it builds connection, builds this bond, and you can really feel a connection to someone else. But leveling up a little bit higher than that is that uncommon commonalities elicit the strongest bond. And I was thinking today about some uncommon interests. I couldn't come up with two uncommon things. I was thinking maybe curling is a pretty uncommon interest, and maybe bonding with someone over that could really elicit a stronger bond. But you can imagine in your head, maybe something that you're really interested in that you haven't really met someone that also does that. So that's actually a way to expedite becoming close with someone. The implications for work, can be when you're onboarding someone is really getting to know all their interests and understanding everyone else on the team to really expedite those bonds and understanding what everyone is interested in. Another suggestion for building bonds between groups and teams and just people at work in general is this idea of origin stories. And this came from organizational psychologist Adam Grant. And so, just really talking about the defining moment that drew you into this work. So how did you get to this place? How did you get to this role? And talking about that can really build bonds between people. The last point on this slide, in-person value. So I know that, we're moving toward a space where there are more remote workers. There are global teams, but there is value to in-person, and there's this concept called mirror neurons. And so basically, it really helps with learning. So it allows you to imitate someone else, and your brain literally mirrors what their brain is doing. So they're mirror neurons. So your neurons do exactly what they're doing. And kind of it helps you empathize, helps you understand where they're coming from. And this is how laughter spreads. And even in sad situations, and you're consoling someone, again, your mirror neurons may be going off. But even in, less emotional settings where you're just trying to look at how someone is planning something or like running a meeting, your mirror neurons may be going off to really understand what someone else is doing and copying them. And we lose that when we're teleconferencing, or we lose that when we're video conferencing. It may be a little bit better in that context, but without it being in person, we are losing that a little bit, and it makes it harder to create this bond. And this is why, being in remote teams is such a barrier to promoting trust in our relationships. So another couple points in terms of really getting to know people is, putting your team in stressful situations. This sounds like a joke. This sounds like this shouldn't be a recommendation. Why would you want to put your team in a stressful situation? But it actually allows you to understand people more. And the reason is because when you see people when they're stressed, you understand what they're like when they're stressed. And so you can understand that part of them, and it doesn't define them. But when you see that behavior again, you understand, oh, that person, there must be stress. So it really allows you to kind of understand them more as a person. And this suggestion sort of came out from some research with teams in NASA when they take teams out, before huge expeditions. They take them to places with, extreme weather conditions and in hugely stressful situations to see how the group reacts. And they do this not to just understand people more, but also to the next point, to get to a place where everyone disagrees so that we can understand how we work in a situation of conflict. And so that's also super important, and working with the team on how to get through that conflict builds a bond as well. The last point I'm going to speak to is vulnerability versus trust, and what comes first. So for us to trust someone, we have to be vulnerable. But often we aren't vulnerable unless we trust them. So that makes it really, really difficult to, expedite building trust in teams and to really cultivate that. So I started thinking about this point, and I remembered this research that had come out a couple of years ago on facilitating bonds and connections between strangers. And it was research on relationships and building relationships and feeling connected with others. And I don't know if you had seen it, because this research had made it to a lot of newspapers in terms of facilitating connections with others. And there's around 36 questions that participants answered with one stranger. And at the end of it, they reported, much closer bonds. In fact, I believe two of the participants in the study ended up getting married. But I definitely think that from that research, it made me think that we can help employees get vulnerable, and in doing so, build the trust. And so I want to share a couple of the questions here. So I just pulled 6 questions, and some of them are quite personal, but definitely you can Google the study and the 36 questions to do with a stranger, and sort of understand what kind of questions they ask to show vulnerability and share with each other. Some of them are pretty easy that I think we could talk about, like before making a telephone call, do you ever rehearse what you're going to say, why, or if you could wake up tomorrow having gained any one quality or ability, what would it be? And that can even link back to, bonding over similar interests. If we look at the question in the bottom right corner, what if anything is too serious to be joked about? Definitely is a personal question. It made me think, is this something that we could ask in a work setting? But I potentially think that it could be super useful because there's certain boundaries that we might not know about someone that we want to make sure that we're not pushing, because that can definitely break down trust with others if, we're saying something that is definitely hurtful to them. So I thought this was sort of an interesting study, and an interesting implication for work is using some of these questions for team building exercises, et cetera, to really help cultivate trust in teams, in groups, whatever it may be. So having said that, I want to go through one of our last main sections in terms of trust, which is when trust is broken, which is something that definitely can happen and has happened, in my personal experience, and I'm sure there's all been a moment for everyone here where they feel like someone or an organization has really broken some of the trust. And so backing up a little bit, how does this happen? And maybe one of these reasons is the reason that should have resonated with you. So inconsistent messaging, inconsistent standards, misplaced benevolence, and lack of transparency. And you can see how these things totally link to a lot of the things that we talked about today in terms of how to facilitate trust. So you can understand doing the opposite obviously would break down that trust. And these 4 points here, I think, can really be applied to any different type of trusting relationship. So whether that be horizontal, vertical, institutional trust, all of these can sort of be applied there. You can see how inconsistent messaging from a person and inconsistent messaging from an organization can definitely break down that trust. So what do we do when that happens? So it's really important to do an assessment. So how did this happen? How long did it take? Thinking about what events led to this, and repairing, and just knowing that repairing may take a long time. And I think in terms of an assessment, I think that this comes from, it really depends on what part of the business this ownership is on. It really depends the context. I think that, maybe a manager needs to do an assessment if they feel like trust has sort of been broken between them and someone on the team, or maybe it's at an institutional level and the C-suite really needs to think about, our employees, I don't know if they have trust in us due to X, Y, Z. And so really doing an assessment on looking at the past year or looking in the past, how did this happen? How long did this take? What were the exact events? And really unpacking that. And knowing that whatever steps that are taken to repair, it's unclear how long that's going to really take. Even despite if trust is lost really fast, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be repaired really fast. It could be the opposite. And so I think that's important to note. Another thing I really want to point out, and I can really emphasize this, is that there's a lag in response to this lack of trust, or this breaking trust, triggers a further lack of trust. And when I think about this statement, this really applies to any relationship and not even just at work. But when someone or, when someone doesn't respond to this like lack of trust right away, and it continues to eat at you, it just makes it worse and worse and harder to rectify. So if, you're aware of someone kind of losing trust in a manager or the organization, the steps taken to sort of facilitate that need to happen right away. And I think even if it's not maybe the steps, but just owning up to the fact that the trust was broken at the very least as a first step, and then going from there is really, really important. So what do you need to rebuild trust once you've done an assessment and you've owned up to it, and now you need to kind of make a plan? So it may require restructuring. Whether that is possible is unclear. That does require a significant amount of work, and people may need to move around a little bit. There may need to be some process management or communication changes. Internally, right now, we don't have someone in charge of communications within our HR team, but that is something that we are looking forward to in the future. And it's definitely something that I would think is worthwhile, especially if there's trust issues, because you want to make sure, like I said earlier in the presentation, that there are major themes to help with trust at work, but what are we actually doing to make sure that that's happening? And so you might need some people that are responsible for that and make a plan for how everything is carried out and how it's communicated. Manager training in terms of fixing broken trust. So all the things that I went through today, even for horizontal or vertical trust, could be helpful for, managers to learn more about and understand how important this is, and then the implications it has and how they can facilitate trust with their teams. And so that might help also with fixing any broken relationships, making measurable goals. So if you are working towards fixing broken trust, whatever the example may be, understanding how you're going to measure success in that situation. So whether that's, engagement metrics or what it may be, just determining that, just to really get buy-in and to understand that like what you are doing is making a difference. Perspective taking, so just understanding where someone's coming from when they feel like their trust has been broken, and it kind of, goes back to owning up to what's gone on. And then alignment on mission and goals. So if it's, from an institutional level of broken trust, you just want to hone in on, okay, we have a lot of people with various feelings about our organization, perhaps because of this lack of mission and vision. And so just really aligning on that and reiterating that to employees to get buy-in. And just some things to keep in mind is that understanding that not everyone reacts the same or will need the same repair plan, and that figuring out what a plan may look like from different levels of the business. So what do the senior leaders need to do if they need to do anything? What should the managers do? What does HR need to do? What do individual contributors need to do? What needs to happen from different areas of the business? One other important caveat to this is proactive repair. So sometimes when one employee is losing trust, and maybe if for an example, they're losing trust from an organizational level, institutional level, and they're sharing that with HR, it's really important that HR, takes steps they need to take to have proactive repair, because it's reasonable to assume that that feeling is not just for that individual. And there's many individuals that may be feeling that way and not be reporting it, but could just, respond in a way by leaving the business. So it's really important to check in with others as well, and coax those back into trusting. So people that have lost trust, just really trying to get them back, because it is hard once trust is broken to really maintain that. But if, someone is owning it and really trying to rebuild it, it has higher odds, of success. So I just want to have share a couple of thoughts with all of you that I came to when I started researching trust. So one is rethinking cultural fit and trust. I think cultural fit is still kind of a buzzword, and we are working more towards cultural ad now, especially with the adverse impacts that the concept of cultural fit does have. I think something sort of interesting to think about is when we use that term, especially when we decide not to hire someone or let someone go, is actually think about maybe it wasn't cultural fit, and to think about if we trusted them. And so, was there one of those aspects of trust that was just not working out with that individual? Did we not find them competent? Did we not think they had integrity? And kind of linking it back there. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about and to sort of unpack and understand more about why we're choosing the people that we are in our organization, or why the people that are succeeding in our organizations are succeeding. So just really something that I want to share that I started thinking about after really studying trust. Another sort of lasting thought that I want to share was thinking about the future of our organizations and talking about all these different concepts. So we have horizontal, we have vertical, and we have institutional trust. But I definitely think, in the future that there will be another domain of trust, maybe technological trust. With this huge move of AI being used instead of people, what implications does that have for people's trust? And there's definitely mixed results. I don't know if you've seen some of the articles about, people's ability to trust AI in predicting medical conditions, but they're highly accurate, more accurate than doctors, and still people really don't trust that. And there's other research also to suggest that people are sort of on the fence in terms of using AI instead of a manager. There was actually a survey about this to see how employees, how much they would trust AI to be a manager for them rather than their real manager. And they found about 5 out of 10 a preference for AI or equal for AI or managers in the US and UK and France. But in other countries, India and China, they actually found a preference for AI over their managers. But again, you'll definitely find mixed results with some people trusting it, some people not trusting it. And so there's definitely going to be a future in which we'll need to figure out if AI and other types of automation and robotics are intertwined with our workplace, how we're helping our people adapt and trust what's going on. So just to sum up what we talked about today, that trust is super basic for our organizations to thrive. Organizations are described as people coming together and working towards a mission. And trust is vital for both relationships and keeping a mission. So basically, it's fundamental for an organization. And from the time an employee begins their journey, they're constantly making judgments about trust. So it's very important that not only it starts off being trustful in terms of the relationship between employees and organizations, but it's maintained throughout the employee experience and is rectified when needed. And the last point I'll just say about how important trust is in the context of today, it is super, super important given all of the change that's happening all around the world. So just to sum up what we've gone through today, this is just overall. I'm not going to break it down back into the different types of trust. This is really just overall, and we've covered all of it. So it's just to really recap, but we have transparency, communication strategies, alignment and messaging and vision, justifications for decisions, and that comes from, not just the business, but managers and other employees, ensuring employees can participate in decision-making when possible, manager training, which I spoke to a little bit in terms of repairing broken trust. Again, like if this information is shared with them, they can start help cultivate trusting relationships for their team or between them and other individuals, encouraging employee voice at meetings, and active listening by managers and leaders, and really anyone. All employees, really, when they demonstrate active listening, are helping to build trust with others that are around them. Coworker events in person. We did speak about the importance of that due to, mirror neurons, and also thinking about activities, not just after hours like food or drinks where people just freely talk, but really having activities that facilitate deeper connections and let people bond over their similarities. And really having a plan to fix broken trust. So when trust is broken, do does the HR team or does the manager have resources to really unpack this and help rectify the situation? Because if it's not rectified, it can lead to turnover and it can spread throughout the business and other employees will be affected. So yeah, that's really just to sum up everything we went over today. We went through a lot of content, but I hope that everyone got something out of it. We have about 3 minutes left. I don't know if we have time for one question.
Hey, Rebecca, thanks so much for the presentation. Let's try to squeeze 2 questions in here if we can. We've got about 3 minutes left. So first question comes from Connor. He says, I've always believed that it's harder to rebuild trust than to gain trust. And when you lose trust, it takes many good impressions to repair. And so when you were talking about repairing trust, could you maybe elaborate a little bit on your thoughts versus Connor's thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. I think that it's hard to be vulnerable again when you've already been vulnerable and someone has broken that. And just going back to that point where don't let time lag and just really try to admit what has gone on and what has broken the trust and admit that mistake right away can really help rectify the broken trust. And I do agree that it's probably going to be harder to repair broken trust than to build it right from the start. But in the truth or in the reality of our situations at work, oftentimes trust might be broken, especially in terms of institutional trust and how like mission and vision is changing or organizational changes are happening and promises might not come through just based on so many different people and so many levels of decisions. So I agree that it is harder to rectify than to just build from the beginning. But given the reality of the situation, that it's often that trust probably will be broken, at the very least following those recommendations can really help to rebuild it. And I think that admitting the mistake right away will go a long way.
All right, thanks for that answer, Rebecca. And then that next question that I think we can fit in comes from Brian. What does it say that employees place greater trust in machine than their manager? And what is this indicative of?
Yeah, no, I thought the same thing. So I am so happy that was brought up. I definitely think because it was a breakdown in terms of the percentage cross-culturally or across the world. So one aspect I thought about was because it was so much higher in other countries, in India and China, that there's something culturally different in terms of the way that their organizations run, that those employees would have more trust in AI than managers. But even in like other countries, it was 50%. And so it made me think about sort of the beginning of the presentation and how I spoke to the lack of interpersonal skills and what are we doing to train our managers, and this sort of the way that our world is changing so that we have less and less in-person interactions, and maybe it's affecting us in ways that we're not as good at being with people and coaching people as we once were. So those were my initial thoughts of those findings, and I'm still stewing on them. So.
All right, Rebecca, thanks so much for that answer. And so we'll go ahead and wrap up for the day. Today's webcast has been approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. Give us just about 24 to 48 hours to process those credit codes, and then you can head on over to your My HCI dashboard. Then go to the Learning section, and from there, download your transcript. So one more big final thank you to everyone who's attended our webcasts over the year, and of course to Rebecca and everyone at Achievers. And so for one final closing, this is from all of us here at HCI.